And I would say that many of the pro-Zionist individuals and, the Israeli government itself have been involved in funding the growth of so-called influencers within the digital space, so that they have in many ways become the so-called thought leaders, the so-called, new intellectuals of our era. The media landscape is divided into, broadly speaking, three types of media. There's public funded media, which is currently being defunded, largely because I think public networks failed in their coverage of Gaza, and that delegitimized them in the eyes of a portion of the audience that traditionally supported public broadcasting. We'll broadly call them the left. The right has traditionally wanted to defund public broadcasting because it offered a critical view of power. And so that's one aspect. The second is state-funded media, which obviously comes with it the risks of disinformation, bias, and red lines. And the third type of media is independent media, which we're seeing sort of explode in the digital space, and which many people assume just is a form of organic evolution of voices in the space. The truth is that many of the people that you see come up in the current era are highly funded by governments and private individuals with the goal of propagating a particular worldview. And I would say that many of the pro-Zionist individuals and, the Israeli government itself have been involved in funding the growth of so-called influencers within the digital space, so that they have in many ways become the so-called thought leaders, the so-called, new intellectuals of our era. And they are defining the parameters of the conversation and ensuring that a lot of what is propagated in various forms, some more overt, like political talk shows, and in some much more less overt, I'd call them covert spaces, whether it's wellness, whether it's fitness, whether it's finance, propagating the same sorts of values, but in different ways. So those are just some of the ways in which I would say that the kind of pro-Israel, kind of pro-Zionist agenda has been widely disseminated within the digital space. We're living in a time where there's a huge erosion of trust in so-called legacy media. So a recent Gallup poll showed that now around only 28% of the public support or trust legacy media to get their news from. So we're seeing a collapse of trust in traditional media sources at the same time as we are seeing the emergence of so-called new media spaces. I think the real thing to be alert to is that none of these new media spaces, whether it's social media spaces, whether it's YouTube, were curated in order to provide freedom of speech or to allow the Palestinian issue, for example, to be discussed openly. That happened in many ways as an error of the platforms. It happened because these platforms were there primarily for commercial purposes, and it just so happened that they weren't as heavily redacted or controlled as other spaces. And so people were able to speak out in these platforms over the course of the last 2 years to put forward much of the information that was actually coming from real journalists, many of them who've lost their lives in the line of duty to report that information. The problem is that those platforms have absolutely clocked on to how they've been used to undermine that the pro-Zionist narrative. And so now we've seen, Larry Ellison taking over TikTok. We're seeing Meta putting in all kinds of restrictions on, criticisms of Zionism, now being conflated with anti-Semitism, even though many anti-Zionists are also Jewish people, so it's completely absurd. But that is what is happening. And so I'm very cautious about a lot of the enthusiasm around the notion that influencers are the new media, because it's important to remember that actually influencers are by and large untrained, incapable of deciphering propaganda, not aware of things like fact-checking, or even frankly, the basic journalistic practice of verifying your sources. And they are, by and large, open to the highest bidder. So you've got to remember that the influencer economy is first and foremost a marketing economy that has trebled in size in the last 5 years and is due to grow to anywhere projected between 35 to 120 billion dollars in the next few years. This space is open to whoever's going to pay the most. And we saw it, of course, with Netanyahu hosting a kind of event with a load of influencers. We know that pro-Israel influencers have been paid anywhere up to like $15,000 per post. So you're really talking about an economy in which so-called influencers are instruments of power, and unfortunately many people are not aware of that happening. So we need to be wide awake about how this new digital economy is being wielded by powers to control the narrative and shut down kind of what was allowed to seep through inadvertently.